On the cold evening of January 15, 1990, thousands of angry citizens gathered outside a massive concrete complex in East Berlin. The air was thick with tension, and the breath of the crowd formed clouds in the winter chill. They stood before the headquarters of the Ministry for State Security, which was known to the world simply as the Stasi. For 40 years, this building had been the fortress of their oppression and the dark heart of a surveillance state that saw everything. The gates that had once been guarded by armed sentries now faced a surging tide of ordinary people who had lost their fear. They demanded entry not with weapons, but with the sheer force of their collective will. Inside the gray office blocks, a frantic operation was underway as officers scrambled to destroy the evidence of their crimes. The sound of industrial shredders roared through the hallways, while men in uniforms tore paper files by hand when the machines overheated and failed. They knew that if the public saw what was written in those files, the true extent of their betrayal would be revealed. Decades of spying and manipulation and psychological torture were recorded in minute detail on millions of pages. The officers stuffed the torn scraps into sacks, hoping to burn or pulp them before the mob breached the perimeter. History was being erased in real time as the clock ticked down toward a confrontation. This moment marked the collapse of one of the most effective and repressive secret police organizations the world has ever known. The stakes were incredibly high for the people of East Germany who sought to reclaim their stolen biographies. If the files were destroyed, the victims would never know who had betrayed them or how their lives had been manipulated from the shadows. The Stasi had not just policed the state, but had infiltrated the very minds of its citizens. They had turned neighbor against neighbor and friend against friend, and even children against parents. The preservation of these documents was essential for justice and for the healing of a nation that had been divided for generations. To understand how this pervasive system of control came to be, we must look back to the aftermath of World War II. The Soviet Union occupied the eastern sector of Germany and established a communist regime that mirrored the paranoia of Joseph Stalin. The German Democratic Republic was founded in 1949 as a bulwark against the West. From its inception, the state leadership believed that their power could only be maintained through absolute control and vigilance. They viewed their own population as potential enemies who might be seduced by capitalism or democratic ideals. In this atmosphere of suspicion, the Ministry for State Security was officially established in February 1950. The organization was modeled closely after the Soviet secret police, and its motto was to be the shield and sword of the party. While it started small, it would eventually grow into a leviathan that dwarfed the Gestapo in terms of size relative to the population. The man who would come to define the Stasi was Erich Mielke. He was a dedicated communist who had fled Germany during the Nazi era and returned with a ruthless determination to protect the socialist state. Mielke would lead the ministry for over 30 years, and he shaped it into an instrument of total surveillance. His obsession with detail and control drove the expansion of the apparatus to absurd lengths. Erich Mielke was a man who believed that everyone was a security risk and that no detail was too small to be recorded. Under his leadership, the Stasi operated on the principle that knowledge was power. He demanded to know everything about everyone who lived within the borders of the German Democratic Republic. This desire for omniscience led to the creation of a vast bureaucracy dedicated to information gathering. The Stasi did not just target political dissidents or foreign spies, but ordinary workers and artists and students. Anyone who showed the slightest sign of nonconformity became a target for observation, and the files began to grow at an exponential rate. The turning point for the expansion of the Stasi came with the construction of the Berlin Wall in August 1961. The physical barrier stopped the mass exodus of East Germans to the west, but it also turned the country into a prison. With the population locked inside, the Stasi turned its gaze inward with renewed intensity. Their mandate was to prevent any internal uprising that might threaten the rule of the Socialist Unity Party. The border troops who guarded the wall were under the supervision of the Stasi, ensuring that the order to shoot anyone attempting to escape was strictly enforced. The wall was the outer shell of the surveillance state. By the 1970s, the Stasi had permeated every level of East German society. The official number of full-time employees grew to over 90,000, which was a staggering figure for a small country. But the true power of the Stasi lay not in its uniformed officers, but in its army of informants. These were the unofficial collaborators known as IMs who lived and worked among the general population. They were the eyes and ears of the state in factories and schools and apartment blocks. It is estimated that at its height, the Stasi commanded a network of nearly 200,000 regular informants. The question that haunts historians and survivors alike is why so many people agreed to spy on their fellow citizens. The motivations for becoming an informant were as varied as the individuals themselves. Some were driven by genuine ideological conviction and believed they were protecting peace and socialism. Others were coerced into service through blackmail or threats against their careers and families. The Stasi excelled at finding the weak point of any individual and exploiting it for their own ends. For some, the motivation was simply material gain or the promise of privileges such as travel permits or a better apartment. The result was a society where trust was systematically dismantled. You could never be sure if your coworker or your drinking buddy or even your spouse was reporting your conversation to the authorities. This atmosphere of fear and suspicion was exactly what the Stasi intended to create. When people are afraid to speak their minds, they self-censor and they withdraw from political life. The Stasi did not always need to arrest people to control them, because the fear of being watched was often enough to ensure obedience. This psychological prison was far more effective than any physical jail cell. The methods of surveillance used by the Stasi were both primitive and surprisingly sophisticated for the time. They employed a massive department dedicated solely to opening mail from the West. Using steam machines and specially designed tools, agents would open letters and read the contents and reseal them without leaving a trace. Millions of letters were intercepted and analyzed for signs of dissent or contact with forbidden organizations. They also tapped telephone lines on a massive scale, recording countless hours of private conversations on magnetic tape. The transcriptions of these calls filled endless shelves in the archives. One of the most bizarre and chilling techniques used by the Stasi was the collection of scent samples. The goal was to track individuals using trained dogs, even if the person had not been seen. Suspects would be brought in for questioning and made to sit on a special fabric cloth or handle a specific object. The cloth would then be placed in a sealed glass jar and stored in a warehouse. These scent jars were labeled with the details of the subject and kept ready for use in case the person went into hiding. It was a scientific approach to hunting human beings that reduced citizens to biological data points. While physical surveillance was constant, the Stasi also developed a dark psychological art known as Zersetzung. This term translates roughly to decomposition or biodegradation. The goal was to destroy the mental stability and reputation of a dissident without arresting them. The Stasi realized that political prisoners created martyrs and drew international condemnation. It was far more effective to quietly ruin a person from the inside out. Zersetzung was a formalized doctrine taught at the Stasi Law College, and it was applied with cold and calculated precision against those deemed hostile to the state. The tactics of Zersetzung were designed to induce paranoia and anxiety and depression. Agents would break into a target's apartment when they were away and make subtle changes. They might rearrange the furniture or replace a brand of tea with a different one, or set the alarm clock to a different time. The victim would begin to doubt their own sanity. They would wonder if they were going crazy or if they were imagining things. The Stasi would also spread vicious rumors about the target in their workplace or neighborhood, destroying their professional and social relationships. The cruelty of these methods lay in their invisibility. To the outside world, the victim simply appeared to be having a breakdown or a string of bad luck. There were no bruises or broken bones to show as evidence of torture. The Stasi manipulated doctors to prescribe the wrong medication or orchestrated failures in the victim's career. They would interfere with car repairs or delay administrative applications. The cumulative effect of these small harassments was often devastating. Many victims of Zersetzung committed suicide or suffered permanent psychological damage without ever knowing the true cause of their misery. For those who were arrested, the destination was often the remand prison at Hohenschönhausen in Berlin. This facility did not appear on any official city maps and was located in a restricted military zone. Prisoners were brought there in windowless vans disguised as grocery trucks or laundry vehicles. Once inside, they were stripped of their identity and referred to only by a number. The prison was designed to isolate the inmate completely from the outside world. The cells were soundproofed and the windows were blocked with glass bricks that allowed in light but offered no view. Interrogations at Hohenschönhausen were a psychological duel between the prisoner and the interrogator. The Stasi had moved away from physical beatings by the 1970s, preferring to use sleep deprivation and isolation to break a suspect. Interrogators would work in shifts, questioning a prisoner for hours or days without rest. They would alternate between threats and feigned kindness, playing the role of a father figure who just wanted to help. The goal was to get the prisoner to sign a confession or to name other dissidents. The interrogators were experts in human psychology and knew exactly which buttons to push. The reach of the Stasi extended far beyond the borders of East Germany. The foreign intelligence branch known as the HVA was widely considered one of the most effective spy agencies of the Cold War. Led for decades by the charismatic Markus Wolf, the HVA infiltrated the highest levels of the West German government. They planted sleeper agents who lived normal lives for years before being activated. These spies stole industrial secrets and military plans and political strategies. They were the invisible soldiers in a silent war that was fought in the offices and ministries of Bonn and beyond. One of the most famous successes of the Stasi was the case of Gunther Guillaume. He was an HVA agent who managed to become a close aide to West German Chancellor Willy Brandt. Guillaume had access to top-secret documents and whispered the Chancellor's private thoughts directly to East Berlin. When he was finally exposed in 1974, it caused a massive political scandal that forced Willy Brandt to resign. It was a masterstroke of espionage that demonstrated the ability of the Stasi to strike at the very heart of the enemy. However, it also hardened the resolve of the West against the communist regime. Domestically, the Stasi maintained a heavy presence in the economy to prevent sabotage and ensure production quotas were met. Officers were stationed in major factories and industrial combines. They monitored the workers for signs of laziness or theft or political dissatisfaction. The economy of East Germany was struggling under the weight of central planning and inefficiency. The Stasi tried to fix these systemic problems through surveillance and coercion, but they only succeeded in creating a climate of fear that stifled innovation. Workers learned to keep their heads down and do the bare minimum to avoid attention. Despite the overwhelming control of the state, there were pockets of resistance that the Stasi could not fully extinguish. The Protestant Church became a sanctuary for those who sought a space for free thought. Under the protection of the church roof, environmental groups and peace activists and punks could gather. The Stasi infiltrated these groups heavily with informants, but they could not simply ban the church without risking a massive backlash. These small groups would eventually form the nucleus of the opposition movement that would challenge the regime in the late 1980s. As the 1980s progressed, the economic situation in East Germany became dire. The infrastructure was crumbling and the pollution was choking the cities, and the shops were empty of basic goods. The population looked to the West via television and saw a world of prosperity and freedom that they were denied. The disconnect between the propaganda of the state and the reality of daily life became impossible to ignore. At the same time, the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev began to implement reforms known as glasnost and perestroika. The Stasi watched with horror as their greatest ally began to open up. The leadership of East Germany, led by Erich Mielke, refused to follow the Soviet example. They dug in their heels and insisted that their course was correct. This stubbornness only fueled the anger of the people. In the autumn of 1989, the fear that had held the nation in check began to evaporate. In the city of Leipzig, citizens began to gather for Monday demonstrations after peace prayers at the St. Nicholas Church. What started as a few hundred people soon grew to thousands, and then tens of thousands. They marched through the streets chanting, "We are the people." The Stasi was caught off guard by the scale and speed of the protests. They had planned for every contingency except a mass uprising of the entire population. Mielke and his generals considered using violence to crush the demonstrations, as the Chinese had done in Tiananmen Square earlier that year. But the local security forces were overwhelmed, and without explicit backing from the Soviet Union, the order to shoot was never given. The Stasi stood by helplessly as the streets filled with citizens who were no longer afraid of them. The shield and sword of the party had been blunted by peaceful protest. On November 9, 1989, the unimaginable happened. Through a botched press conference and a wave of confusion, the border crossings of the Berlin Wall were opened. Thousands of East Berliners streamed into the West, greeted by cheering crowds. The symbol of division and imprisonment had fallen. For the Stasi, this was the end of their world. The legitimacy of the state they protected had vanished overnight. In the days that followed, the focus of the secret police shifted from surveillance to self-preservation. They knew that a reckoning was coming, and they needed to hide the evidence of their deeds. The order went out to destroy the files. In offices across the country, Stasi officers began the frantic work of shredding and burning. The smoke from the incinerators turned the sky gray over Stasi district headquarters. They prioritized the files that identified their informants and the records of their most brutal psychological operations. But the sheer volume of paper was their undoing. The shredders jammed and the fires could not burn fast enough. The paper trail of 40 years could not be wiped out in a few days. The citizens of East Germany saw the smoke and realized what was happening. This brings us back to that cold day in January 1990 at the Normanenstrasse complex. The citizens' committees that had formed during the revolution demanded access to the site to stop the destruction. When the gates opened, the people entered the inner sanctum of the secret police. They found piles of torn paper and sacks filled with shredded documents. They secured the archives and set up watches to ensure no more files were removed. It was a historic act of reclaiming the truth. The hunters had become the hunted, and the secrets of the dictatorship were now in the hands of the people. In the aftermath of the revolution, a fierce debate erupted over what to do with the Stasi files. Some argued that they should be destroyed to preserve social peace and prevent acts of revenge. They feared that opening the archives would poison the atmosphere of the newly reunified Germany. But the victims and civil rights activists insisted that the files must be preserved. They argued that there could be no reconciliation without truth. The decision was made to open the records to the public. A special government agency was created to manage the archives and facilitate access for victims. The agency, known as the BSU, became a model for how to deal with the legacy of a dictatorship. Millions of people applied to see their files. For many, the experience was cathartic, allowing them to make sense of the past. But for others, it was a source of profound trauma. They sat in reading rooms and discovered that their best friends or their siblings or even their spouses had been informing on them for years. The betrayal was intimate and personal. Marriages collapsed and friendships ended as the toxic legacy of the Stasi continued to poison lives long after the regime had fallen. One of the most shocking revelations was the extent to which the Stasi had utilized children and teenagers. They had recruited minors as informants, enticing them with adventure or threatening their future educational prospects. The ruthlessness of a system that would weaponize the innocence of youth against their own families was laid bare in the files. The documents also revealed the petty nature of the reports. Informants had recorded the most mundane details about what people ate, or what music they listened to, or who they slept with. It was a monument to the banality of evil. Erich Mielke, the man who had built this machine of terror, was arrested and put on trial. However, proving his direct responsibility for specific acts of oppression proved legally difficult under the existing laws. He was eventually convicted not for his crimes as the head of the Stasi, but for the murders of 2 police officers he had committed as a young communist militant in 1931. He spent his final years in prison in a nursing home, a shadow of the man who had once held the power of life and death over millions. He died in 2000, taking many secrets to his grave. Today, the former Stasi headquarters at Normanenstrasse is a museum. Visitors can walk through the office of Erich Mielke, which has been preserved exactly as he left it. The furniture is beige and the telephones are red, and a white death mask of Lenin hangs on the wall. It is a time capsule of a bureaucracy that went mad with power. The museum serves as a warning to future generations about the dangers of unchecked state surveillance. It stands as a testament to the fact that freedom is fragile and must be constantly defended. The work of reconstructing the shredded files continues to this day. Sophisticated computer algorithms are being used to piece together the millions of scraps of paper that were torn up in the final days of the regime. It is a giant jigsaw puzzle with millions of pieces. Every reconstructed page adds another detail to the historical record. It is a slow and painstaking process, but it sends a powerful message. No matter how hard a dictatorship tries to destroy the truth, it can eventually be recovered. The legacy of the Stasi is not just a matter of history, but a relevant lesson for the modern world. In an age of digital surveillance and big data, the questions raised by the East German experience are more urgent than ever. The Stasi had to rely on steam machines and human informants to gather information. Today, governments and corporations have access to technology that Erich Mielke could only have dreamed of. The potential for abuse is vast, and the need for oversight and transparency is critical. The story of the Stasi is a dark chapter in human history, but it is also a story of resilience. It is the story of how a population eventually stood up to a system that tried to crush their spirit. It reminds us that the desire for freedom and privacy is universal. The files in the archives are not just dusty paper. They are the voices of the victims reclaiming their dignity. As long as we remember what happened in East Germany, we arm ourselves against the return of such tyranny. The whisper of time speaks clearly here, telling us to watch the watchers.